I mean, another thing which Mr. Abley, I mean, certainly in his own, because as we get to the end, he's left a document which basically, here is my fiendish plan, kind of, as it were. But it's kind of
and to him it's not a fiendish plan. To him it's like, well, if you have to do this, then you have to do it. I mean, come on.
He has, but I mean, his mentality towards it is that this is perfectly justified because these people are lesser. In some way, he dislikes using the word victim, or that dislikes the term murdered being used to apply to how Simon Magus was able to fly through the air with the aid of the spirit of a child he'd done in.
He had, in some libelous fashion, murdered.
Yeah, and this is a profoundly anti-Christian point of view.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's why it's said that he specializes in the study of the pagan Greeks, because he's an animist. He's the kind of person who believes that it's perfectly fine to consume other people's lives.
Yeah, if you are of a superior kind of bent, whereas on a Christian level, there's sort of the idea of every human soul is of equal. Every human life, every human soul is of equal importance to God in that particular, in a Christian worldview, in the worldview that we have to assume that James would have, that we presume James would have been in sync with, which, interestingly enough, is kind of like quite the sort of the paganistic, but it's kind of quite interesting. Thinking of Machen, how that attitude turns up in the Great God Pan, and the attitude of the surgeon.
Yes,
he's basically, I saved Mary, Mary, I think is the girl's name, he operates on from dying. So I believe her life is mine to dispose of as I see fit. I'm pretty sure the law would disagree.
And also she loves him, so she's like, yeah, absolutely.
But the inmost light, which I think are often overlooked Macken's story, has a similar thing where the doctor's wife agrees to let him do this operation on her. Of course you can. You're my husband. You can do whatever you like, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's sort of like he takes out her soul. It's sort of like he removes her soul, which somehow is located inside her head. So and it's a crystal, this beautiful crystal. And
I must admit, when I read the title, The Inmost Light, I assumed it was going to be one of Macken's more, sort of gentler, kind of more
let's go towards the inmost light. No, it's like this, it's like, I took out her soul, here it is. Nice, huh?
Yes,
it's too bad she's like a fucking fiend now, but
Yeah, the guy does the autopsy, says that brain was not a human brain, it was the brain of a devil. Yes. Whatever the brain of the devil may actually resemble.
Yeah, exactly. Again, and you're sort of like, how do you know? But it's as though she's become like this horrifying zombie, but like ravenous and awful. And like you get the feeling that she's impossible to be around because she just wants to destroy everything.
Yeah. I mean, when it came, Machen didn't really have any kind of aversion to the idea of just bumping women off, did he?
No.
They treated their lives as quite disposable. I mean, when you think of the end of the Great God Pan, it's like, the guy's got no, it's like, it's never suggested there's anything wrong with this idea that I'm going to be judge, jury, and executioner if necessary. And
well, on the other hand, is Helen a person? She looks like a woman.
Incidentally, if you're not familiar with it, I strongly recommend Roseanne Rabinowitz's novella Helen's Story, which picks up from Helen Vaughan's point of view in the present day, where she basically says, that guy really thought I was just going to go and do myself in just because he said so. I mean, what the fuck? I remember thinking, even at the time when I read it, it's like, okay, so she's this like demonic, this terrifying
creature who can make, people go insane by essentially, as far as I can tell, devolving and then evolving back again.
Presumably when they're on the job with her, perhaps. I don't know. I do remember a discussion with I had with Joel Lane about Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep, and speculating on the sex lives of Edward and Asenath, and did she ever flip them round when they were in bed, of thing.
I know. Yes, and people now, of course, when they're playing with that part of the Lovecraftian mythos. It's like, let's see how far we can go with that.
Yeah.
Carrie Laban does some great stuff with that in A Hawk in the Woods. Yeah, which is very much based around that particular story.
I'd have to check that out, because I've long had sort of some ideas and some notes jotted down in the back of my brain somewhere for writing a sort of story from Asenath Waite's point of view. But I better make sure I'm not. I haven't been beaten too much to the punch here.
Well, I think there were about 3 people who chose to do Asenath Waite stories for Cthulhu's Daughters. Daughters. Yeah, Cthulhu's Daughters. So, yeah, check it out.
Yes,
it's worth it. At any rate, the point being that
back to James.
Back to James. So we've got this sort of back and forth between the very physical world and the sort of, and people allowing themselves to think, well, we can map the physical world so beautifully and so scientifically now that maybe good and evil don't exist anymore. Maybe there is no good or bad. Maybe there is no, maybe there is no right or wrong. Yeah, more than good or bad, right or wrong. Maybe there is no right or wrong. And then being sort of like bitch slapped by
yes.
And not bitch slapped in a God out of the machine kind of way, because it's not like, God comes down and goes, you just stop doing that. It's more like, no, seriously.
Yeah.
There are things you shouldn't fuck with. There are things you shouldn't look at. There are things you shouldn't do. And I would think that you were smart enough to know this yourself, because you are an academic or an antiquarian or a,
Yes. It kind of goes back to what we were discussing in the first podcast about how a great deal of supernatural fiction involves people crossing a line, crossing a boundary.
Absolutely.
And I think I remember reading an essay on James where you could basically, I think it said you could basically 2 or 3 rules which which the characters usually end up breaking, which is don't meddle with things you don't understand, being one of the I mean, not always, of course. In the case of casting the runes, the main character's only offence has been to say, well, I think this is an absolute load of horseshit, and incur the wrath of an extremely vindictive individual with
an extremely vindictive individual who has himself gone too far.
Yes.
This is the thing, he that particular character, the character from casting the runes, thinks of himself again as a hermetic magician, and it's like the most it really is like that. It's a holdover from, I don't know, like the late 1600s, the early 1700s, where you had a lot of scientific knowledge suddenly coming up, but people also believed the most heinous bullshit at the same time. And there was no way of telling the heinous bullshit from the scientific knowledge. People still believed in humors. People still believed that, women's wombs bounced around inside their bodies, and,
You're like, this does not happen. This does really
it's like, no. So, I mean, and again,
Republicans in America possibly still think they do.
Very beautifully put across this type of sort of pseudoscience, where it's almost like a commingling of magic and science, is very beautifully put across in Nigel Neal's screenplay originally, teleplay originally, and now the BBC has done a wonderful radio adaptation of it with Mark Gatiss, of The Road, where you run up against, a person who is a thoroughgoing scientist, but he's a scientist in the same way that he's a zealot, and then running up against a person who is an absolute rationalist and only believes in what he can see and what he can feel, and who then sees and feels something that he cannot prove at all. And realizes that the scientific zealotry of the other person is eventually going to lead to this terrible thing happening in the future.
I remember a novel I was working on last year had I was researching characters like John B, the magician, who was actually a scientist and astronomer of some, a mathematician of some note, but also an occultist. But of course, all of these things were areas of study. I mean, if you remember Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus, he's looking at the different sort of areas of science. He's looking at physics, medicine. He's looking at Justinian, which is the law, and then divinity is one of the other subjects.
That's right.
And it's like he goes for magic because that can actually take him beyond what he already, this circumscribed pool of knowledge that we already have. But again, divinity, the study of the stuff. I mean, people still took more or less. A lot of people still believe that there was a soul, there was a god, there were angels, there was all sorts of
like
stuff.
The spheres of the universe, and how do they act upon each other, very little difference between astronomy and astrology, for example.
There was a lot of overlap. People were still trying to work stuff out, and when all you've got is, again, you've got what people have concluded in the past, who believed in their own gods and all the rest of it. So you're kind of piecing it together, and it was all this. It was all very much.
So so in a way, James is crossing over into Macan territory here, and basically saying that if you tell yourself that you should be able to use power just because you have it, just because you've mastered it. And therefore, it is up to you to say what's right is that I should use it any way I see fit. And what's wrong is that I should master it and then never use it. Then you are a Macan-like type of sinner. You are going against the natural order of the universe. And even this thing that he wrote. Much later in his life, he wrote a very brief story called "The Malice of Inanimate Objects," which I think actually is something that explains a lot of the charge of James when he really gets going. Because it is all about the malice of inanimate objects. It's about the malice of a sheep, or the malice of a flute, or the malice of a bag that isn't actually a bag. The malice of a bolster that isn't actually a bolster. Yes, and but a lot of it is also about or the malice of a crown. I think I began with
the warnings to the curious.
Exactly.
I mean, with both that and with Count Magnus, there is this thing of there is of the consequences that fall upon the person for their transgression go way above and beyond anything, certainly, and or certainly go above and beyond the sort of the act itself. And most frighteningly, of course, there's no forgiveness for it. Once
what can one do but lock the door and cry to God? And God doesn't answer, and that's the interesting thing. You expect that because he's such a religious dude, that there will be a lot of it's like I went to a priest and the priest helped me. No, it's actually, you have to think your way out of these things a lot of the time. And sometimes you can't think your way out of these things. And sometimes you're just standing by and watching them happen, as in the mezzotint, which, is just about a mezzotint that changes every time you look away from it. And it tells a little story. And at the end, something that you didn't know before, but nothing that you do can alter the function of the mezzotint. It's like It's not like you can ever save that child. It's not like you can ever, it's not like you learning what happened, has any real reckoning on anything. It's just sort of like something reaching out from the past and going, let me transmit